It's the desk at which I wrote my doctorate in the early 80s on a Commodore 64. And I put it up there just because it does remind me of quite how much the kind of technical process of archiving and thinking about research and writing has changed in what seems to me a mere 30 years. And of course, that was all the kind of 5¼ inch discs. And I still have all the note cards. But I also thought that it was a nice image to think about, well, both archiving and research. Because I was kind of asked to come and talk a bit about how the changing nature of that object of study is itself changing how we go about research, changing the ways in the kinds of questions we ask, and change perhaps also the ways in which we actually present the information we go out and discover and come back and work up. And my problem with that, and that's all great, is that, of course, I normally just work on dead people. I work on really dead people. The people I work on have been dead for 200 years. They ain't getting up. They aren't born digital. They were definitely born analog. And as a result, I'm that oldest of old school things. I'm a text historian for the most part. I'm the kind of historian who sits there and reads books. And I'm the kind of historian who more recently sits there and does textual analysis on versions of texts. But the digital and the online, what the Web Archive is collecting is different. How we find things, the conundrums of search, that in turn shape the questions we ask, are all changed. The conundrums of that research journey does, for instance, big data and new forms of visualization, all the things we've just been hearing about, imply a new open-eyed interrogation. One of the things that kept coming to my mind during the last presentation is a visualization a kind of value-free thing that we look at in order to discover anomalies and patterns? Or is it actually a fully ideologized object that is used to present particular types of information to make an argument? I mean, that is the kind of issue that is changed when we start to do work with born digital and big data sources. I mean, one of the things I worry about at the moment is if we're moving from, like, social science models, where we have a model of how we think things work and we test them, to something that is more open-eyed, more able to actually discover new forms of relationships and new causalities. And if we are, should these new approaches take the form of a kind of scientific interrogation? I don't know if many of you have come across the culturomics movement out of Harvard, which essentially is saying that what we can do now that all culture, all our products, our data, is actually go and interrogate that in a newly scientific way. And they very explicitly use those terms and sell what they do as the discovery of new kinds of truth. Whereas in a humanist tradition, what most people have done traditionally is a much more impressionistic, qualitative analysis of changes in ideas that are not truth claims in the same way. Or perhaps, let's see. Or perhaps the new things we do should take the form of a re-engagement with things like the longue durée. I don't know if people have been following the argument over the History Manifesto, which was published by CUP a few months ago, claiming that historians have been entirely wrong, basically just entirely wrong, and that the authors are entirely right to advocate for the creation of histories that span thousands of years, but which are essentially directed at changing modern policy. In other words, what it seems to me is that all of this stuff has thrown into real argument what humanist scholars are doing, what we are doing as academics, how we're actually using stuff. And it's throwing up with every new tool, with every new type of visualization, with every new algorithm for pulling out sentiment, every new black box thing. A challenge to ask us not just What are we trying to do, but why? What is the purpose of what we're doing? And do these new tools actually serve that purpose? One of the things that really bothers me, well, one of the terms that I really like in association with visualization is the notion of the shock and awe graph. The idea that if you get the graph big enough, colorful enough, with enough nodes and enough bits of information on it, your audience will simply be overwhelmed. You don't have to make an argument because a graph does it. And that kind of issue of how do we actually stay true to the kind of argument and conversation that humanities scholarships has traditionally been about, in a world where somebody can come along and throw up a massive graph that is meant to shut you up, is something that I think we need to worry at. Or perhaps, we should actually be returning to close reading, combined with things like radical contextualization. One of the things that I really love about what's currently available is that possibility of not saying, well, all of this changes what we do, but it actually makes traditional forms of scholarship better. If you think about that one word that might be the basis of a whole dissertation, what has actually changed is not our ability to read that word, but our ability to contextualize it. One of the things like the n-gram viewer, for example, allows you to say, well, here is an expression. Here is a word. How is it used at a particular time, and how does it change? And we couldn't have done that 15 years ago. So one of the things that's happened is that our ability to actually interrogate stuff has changed. And of course, the online and the digital also raises issues around history writing as a genre and a form of publication. If you think about open access, linked data, open data, and the crisis of the monograph, the idea that somehow the monograph should be dead, that the book should be dead, all of those challenge us to think again about the kind of writing we do as a literary form. What people have been talking about today is actually the research process. We have been talking about how do you get the information you need out of this archive, this particular archive. But once you have it as a search, once you have it as a dynamic body of information, why are you then going to turn it into something that could have been produced 200 years ago? Why isn't your PhD going to be a graphic novel? Why not insist on publishing the research data with your literary overlay? Why not do something different? Why not self-publish it? What is it that is preventing you doing all those things? And I suspect, for good reason, nobody in this room is going to write their PhD as a graphic novel because they're too worried that the Academy won't take it seriously. They're too worried that if we don't follow the conventions of a traditional academy, we won't actually be allowed within the hierarchy and structure of the academy. But ironically, all those conundrums haven't had much effect on the academy and the kind of scholarship we do. One of the real ironies of the last 15 to 20 years is that while data has changed, what we can do with it has changed, how we search for it has changed, what we produce and the questions we ask have remained largely the same as they were 30 years ago. Like I say, how we do it has changed. The research journey has changed, but what it looks like feels to me very familiar. So that's, in a sense, where I end up as a kind of textual historian working on very dead people. And the kind of websites I've been involved in, things like the Old Bailey Online, are absolutely simply digital versions of things that are hard copy and could as easily be books. But the born digital, it seems to me, is different. Arguably, the sorts of things I do, the history about properly dead people, look conservative and are conservative because they necessarily engage with the categories of knowing that dominated the 19th and 20th centuries. These were centuries of text, organized into libraries of books and commentated on by cadres of increasingly professional historians. In other words, the reason people aren't doing more different kinds of history is that most of what we work on is actually structured around an old school library. The born digital, and most importantly the web archive, is just different. It sings to a different tune and demands different questions. And if anywhere is going to change practice, it should be here. In other words, it strikes me that what the Born Digital and the Digital Archive, the Web Archive does is actually challenge us to do something very, very different. Now, to my frustration, I don't work on the web as an object of study, and therefore I feel uncertain about what it can answer and how its form is shaping the conversation we're having. But I do want to spend some time this afternoon simply suggesting that it and the Web Archive provides an opportunity to rethink what's possible and to rethink what it is we're asking and how we might ask it and to what purpose, and arguably, by extension, how we might publish it. I suppose the way I want to frame this is to suggest that the web itself brings onto a single screen a series of forms of data that can be subject to lots of different forms of analysis. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me, and over the last hour or two as well, is the extent to which we think of a web page as a page. That is a form of skeuomorphism. It is a form of metaphor that actually has no meaning in this. A few years ago, there was a big movement to incorporate APIs, application programming interfaces, into a lot of websites that allowed people in the wider community to access data, to separate it off. And the idea was that you would actually create a new search engine, a new facility that allowed you to interrogate data at a distance more effectively. The comment that really struck me at the time is that the web itself is a form of API, and that by extension the Web Archive is subject to the same kind of reimagination, constant repurposing, that an API allows for a single site or source. And as a result, you can, if you want, treat a simple text, treat it as simple text, and apply all the tools of distant reading of text with that wonderful sense of a million words consumed in one gulp. But you can also do something different. You can apply topic modeling and latent semantic analysis, things that I think you've discussed this morning, or word frequency, inverse document frequency measures, or even more simply, you can simply count words. But the problem is that by thinking about these as pages that collect words, you're missing a whole series of dimensions to that web page. And you can go beyond those kinds of analysis. In performance art, in geography and archaeology, in music and linguistics, new forms of reading are emerging with each passing year that seem to me to significantly challenge our sense of the object of study, both text and web page. In part, this is simply a reflection of the fact that all our senses and measures are suddenly open to new forms of analysis and representation. When everything is digital, when all forms of stuff come to us down a single pipeline, everything can be read in a new way. And I suppose being asked to talk about the future of research, what I'm trying to suggest is that the object of study itself is changing and that we can change research in dialogue with it. Consider for a moment this. This is a live project from the Royal Veterinary College in London and their haptic interface. In this instance, what they've developed is a full-scale haptic representation of a cow in labor facing a difficult birth, which allows the student to physically engage and experience the process of manipulating the calf in situ without actually having to put the calf in danger. I haven't tried this myself, but I'm told that it is a mind-altering experience. It really does feel like having your hand up to the elbow in a cow. And it suggests that reading too can be different, and should include perhaps the haptic, the feel and heft of a thing in your hand. I mean, after all, that's being coded for millions of objects through 3D scanning. But we do not yet have a way of, if like, comparing that 3D scanning against the text that goes with it, the weight and heft of something against the semantic content of something else. The same could be said about the oral, that weird world of sound, on which we continually impose the order of language, music, and meaning, but which is in fact a stream of sensations filtered through place and culture. Projects like this, such as the Virtual St. Paul's Cross project, which allows you to hear John Donne's sermons from the 1620s from different vantage points around the square where it was given, changes how we imagine them, and moves from text to something more complex and something much more powerful, and begins to navigate that normally unbridgeable space between text and the material world. And if you think about this in relation to music and speech online, you end up with something different on a massive scale. And the point really is just to say that most of us think about the web, think about data as some form of text. But the minute you actually step beyond text, what you end up with is a whole series of other things that you can compare with it. One of my current projects is to create a soundscape of the courtroom at the Old Bailey, to recreate that oral experience of the defendant, what it felt like to speak to power, and what it felt like to have power spoken to you from the bench, and in turn to use that knowledge to assess who was more effective in their dealings with the court. And the point of the project is to simply add one or two more variables to the ones we can securely derive from the text itself. It's an attempt to add just a couple more columns to a spreadsheet of almost infinite categories of knowing. And you can keep going. You can add weather, sunlight, temperature, the presence of the smells and reeks of other bodies. There are a whole series of things that as text scholars we have tended to exclude completely from our analysis. And what the data allows us to do, what the web archive allows us to do, what the Born Digital allows us to do, is actually to add more and more and more columns to that spreadsheet of analysis. And the work of people like Ian Gregory, who's out of Lancaster and is coming out of historical geography, we can see the beginnings of new ways of reading both the landscape and the textual leavings of the dead, for example. A couple of colleagues and I, with a lot of others, tried to do the same thing with some Old Bailey material on the geography of London. And this is where we ended up. This is a simple mapping of where the colors, blue, red, and yellow versus brown and green, show up in terms of trials and crime locations. So basically, it is where in London in the 18th century people thought they saw red and blue and green and brown and yellow. I don't know what the fuck it means, quite frankly. It is a complete bemusement to me. I have stared at it again and again and get nowhere beyond a simple awe at that challenge to say that text and place can be analyzed together in a way that 20 years ago would never have occurred to me. All of which should be, to state the obvious, in some ways you're all here because you realize that the digital makes it possible to do new things. And there are lots of new readings that change how we connect with humanist and historical evidence, whether that is text or something more interesting. In creating new digital forms of inherited culture, the stuff of the dead, we naturally innovate and naturally enough discover ever-changing readings. But the web archive challenges us, it seems to me, to do a lot more than that, and to begin to unpick what you might start pulling together from that near infinite archive, that incredible and constantly growing archive. In other words, while most of us have been concentrating on the tools of text and are moving in the right direction, there are several more dimensions that we can begin to exploit when the object of study is itself a kind of encoding. I mean, each web page, for instance, embodies a dozen different forms. The text is the obvious stuff, but it's important to remember that each component of the text, each word and letter on a web page, is itself a complex composite. What happens when you divide the text by font or font size, weight, color, kerning, formatting? And that's just the beginning. I mean, those are all encoded, those are all necessary in order to display text on a web page. And yet, I don't know anybody who thinks very hard, and I probably just don't get out much, thinks very hard about the relationship between the weighting and font that's used in different web pages and the types of content that they are meant to purvey. By location, in the header or the body, or wherever the CSS sends it, or more subtly by where it appears to the user's eyes, in the middle of a line or at the end. Most all web pages are designed with a particular screen size and layout in mind. What happens when you change it? How does the way you read something change when you're reading it on your smartphone as opposed to a desktop? I mean, yes, it all moves around, but it suddenly becomes important to know what the design is designed to be read for. And suddenly, all the forms of analysis we have associated with distant reading, to all those, there are 5 or 6 further columns in the spreadsheet derived from the underlying code. 5 or 6 new variables to investigate in that kind of big data, open-eyed sort of ways. And that's just a text. The page itself is both a single image and a collection of them, each with its own properties. And one of the great things that's coming out of image research is that we can begin to automate the process of analyzing those screens as images. Color, layout, face recognition. Each page is suddenly 10 images all mashed together, all available as a new variable in a new column in the spreadsheet of analysis. And of course, the same could be said of embedded audio and video. What do we do? How do we actually understand the voice, the sound that's embedded in a streamed audio when we read it against the text that is displayed at the front of a web page? And all of that is before we even look under the bonnet. The code, the links, the metadata for each page. In part, we can think of this as another iteration of text, but more imaginatively, we can also think about it as a series of other variables in the mix. And of course, the problem there is that it then, again, simply misunderstands the web and the web archive. The metaphor that we all use of the page is the intellectual equivalent of a skeuomorphism, of relying on material world metaphors to understand the online. But these aren't pages at all. They are collections of code and data that generate into an experience in real time. They don't exist until they are used, and if a website in the forest is never accessed, it simply doesn't exist. The web archive, therefore, is not an archive of objects, but a snapshot from a moving film of possibilities. At its most abstract, what the web archive has done is spirit into being the very object that it seeks to capture. And of course, we all know that in doing so, the capturing itself changes the object. Schrödinger's cat may be alive or dead, but its box is definitely open. And we have visited our observations on its content. The very fact that we have collected this stuff has changed what it is. So, to add to all the layers of stuff that can fill our spreadsheet, there also needs to be a column for time and use, reuse, and republication. And all of this is before we seek to change the metaphor and talk about networks and connections instead of pages on a website. And where I end up is seriously jealous of the possibilities and seriously wondering what the object of study might be. It is not that the web archive is simply new and joyous and beautiful, and it is all those things. It is that it is a fundamentally different thing. And we really kind of need to reinvent the humanities, reinvent what we're asking, reinvent the methodologies in new ways in order to actually make it sing. And the question for you lot, it seems to me, is how do we turn something we really can't understand, can't really capture as an object of study, to serious purpose? How do we think at one and the same time of the web as alive and dead, as code, text, and image, all in a dynamic conversation one with the other? And even if we can hold all that at once, what's the purpose of our asking? And that's really all I have to say. I wanted to end with this image, which is probably one that's familiar to many of you. It's basically all the tweets during the London Olympics in 2012, color-coded by language. And it is, in many respects, it seems to me, a shock and awe image, designed to throw you on the back of your seat and leave you wondering what it all means. You look and you see tiny bits of pattern and tiny bits of correlation, and you think, oh, there must be meaning there. Quite frankly, I'm not sure there is. On the other hand, I'm absolutely certain that the Web Archive and the opportunity to actually study culture in the making in 6 and 7 and 8 dimensions is something worth pursuing and something that is actually kind of exciting. So thanks. And any questions? Sorry, how are we doing for time? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that I did try to do very briefly was, because I was looking at disability websites, was to try and see whether they fit the web accessibility guidelines that were set out,
Yeah.
and whether they would have been readable on a screen reader. Because obviously we think about it as a page as a visual thing, but actually for blind people, the web isn't a visual thing, it's audio thing. Which kind of got me, I mean, I had to abandon it because I just didn't know enough about the code to be able to make any sense of it. But one of the things that you said about a web page in the forest, it's never looked at, doesn't exist, and that kind of stuff is, I wonder whether it's much more difficult to judge audience with the web than it is with, I mean, with the old daily papers, you know that one, that's a textual representation of a thing, what happened. Two, we know for who that was written for, whether they necessarily read it or not. Whereas with the web, it seems to be very difficult to judge who the audience is, and by capturing it, you change what the audience is as well.
Except that actually knowing who it was who the past was written for and who read it is completely bemusing. And there's a whole reader response theory and reader reception analysis has hit brick walls for decades. There's a nice web project trying to crowdsource examples of people actually reading stuff in the historical record, and it's been going for 10 years, and I think they have 3 examples so far. It's been really a hard-going process. So I'm not actually convinced that the story of what we had before is quite as you've represented it. On the other hand, it strikes me that actually you simply look at the reports from Google Analytics on a web page. You look at what is actually possible to capture, and the opportunities to create a theory of reception strikes me as much more likely in a digital environment than in a traditional book environment. But that's just me being optimistic. I don't know.
I don't have a question, Tim, but I have an observation, which is in regards to what the challenge you set out to us is to get beyond the text.
Yeah.
To go beyond the text, to get outside of that constraining environment of the text. Not to neglect it, but to realize there are all these other variables, other factors you can consider and think of. And I find that incredibly challenging, but maybe it's also partly because I'm not the born digital generation. And I don't know, I mean, and that's the open question, is there a generational change from those, perhaps even everyone in this room is too old for that?
Anybody here born before, after 1993? Yeah. How about after 1988, which is when HyperCard, Apple's HyperCard was introduced in the first. Yeah, I know. I mean, quite frankly, I think anybody born in the 1960s is young. I say 1950s is the last good decade, but that's it. I actually don't think that the problems are about generation. I actually think they're about the intellectual structures of the academy and the way in which we take disciplines and force people into them. Nobody is naturally a historian versus a literary critic. Nobody should naturally be a humanist or a social scientist. I mean, if the questions are big enough, we should be able to use all the tools. But of course, we can't because, oh my God, my head of school might disown me, and that's never fun.
But that's not to say that in 20 years' time, when people in this room are in positions of high up head of school, it might change, right? Maybe it's a later response. But.
Well, okay. I mean, the one thing I would say is that I share your optimism. Well, no, actually, I'm a misanthropist. I don't share anybody's optimism. But I kept on expecting that. Well, I keep on looking for where the changes are coming. And the areas that are most conservative, it seems to me, are in terms of publication, the representation of authority in the academy, and the hierarchies and how you divide up the bailiwicks of intellectual life. And I think those kinds of boundaries are actually much, much harder to pull down than any technical boundaries associated with what you can do. I mean, Christ, you could have written a beautiful, fully integrated, non-linear book on a CD-ROM 20 years ago and done something wild and beautiful with it in terms of the intellectual journey that people take through text and evidence. And yet, nobody does that. What we do instead is we write monographs that you're supposed to sit down and read from page 1 to page 256 with the index at the back. And that's just as weird. But I do think, and so my optimism is limited. Yes. Yeah.
Maybe an obvious question, but okay. So I know archived web is not the same as the web,
Mm-hmm.
but it does bear.
It's a representation of it.
Yeah. So do people not have the same issue when researching using the live web? So two possibilities. One is that they don't, because you've hit the same problems, similar issues. The other answer might be they do, but there is Google, therefore there isn't such a problem. So what is it?
You mean that what we've come up against is the good enough answer? The Google good enough first page results that mean that we don't have to interrogate as precisely the nature of the algorithm that produces the other 500,000 results. And I think that's there is a real challenge there in terms of modeling what we think we do as scholars. And the fact that Google actually doesn't engage with the academy in any substantive way is perhaps a measure of that.
But people do research using live web, don't they?
Yeah. I mean,
I don't hear the sort of similar methodological issues.
yeah. Well, I think they're lying. I mean, I think they're actually charlatans, and they should be shot, each and every one. What we all do is we go to JSTOR, we go to these online resources, and we look things up, and we say we read them online, and then we cite them like we sat in a bloody library and read them with a pencil in our hand, and we didn't. And I think that that's actually an absolute lie, and we all do it. And I suppose the point I would make, I guess, is that you're right, that people using the live web lie just as often as people using the web archive lie. And all I can say about that is they're both lying, and that we need to get better standards.